What if the thing you use to prove you belong is the very thing keeping you from resting? What if the thing that tells you who you are is the thing Paul is asking you to let go of? Galatians 6:14 says, "But far be it from me to boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ." Most Christians hear that verse and immediately think, don't boast in yourself, boast in Jesus. And certainly that is true. But why did Paul need to say it? Why here? Why now? What was happening in Galatia that made this statement necessary? Because the argument surrounding this verse is not really about boasting, at least not in the way we normally think about it. And strangely enough, it's not primarily about circumcision either. Now that may sound odd, because circumcision is everywhere in Galatians. Paul talks about it repeatedly. His opponents are demanding it. The churches are being pressured into it. Controversy seems obvious. Circumcision appears to be the issue. But what if circumcision is only the surface issue? What if something deeper was happening beneath it? For generations, circumcision had marked out the covenant people of God. This wasn't just another religious ceremony. It was the covenant sign God had given to Abraham, the visible marker that he had identified them as God's people for generations. Think about it. After all, Christianity had emerged from Israel. The God Israel worshipped was a God the church proclaimed, and the scriptures they treasured told Israel's story. So it wasn't difficult to conclude that the covenant sign should remain part of God's people. So it's not difficult to understand why some believers wanted to keep circumcision at the center. If you wanted certainty, if you wanted clarity, if you wanted a visible answer to the question who truly belongs to God's people, circumcision seemed like an obvious answer. A measurable answer, a visible answer, a reassuring answer. If Christianity emerged from Israel, then surely the sign of Israel still mattered. At least that's the logic. And that's where Paul's concern begins, because something subtle is happening, something dangerous, something that can happen all too readily. The cross was no longer enough on its own. Jesus was no longer enough on his own. The issue wasn't the practice itself. The issue was the place it had become to occupy. What God had given as a sign was now being treated as a condition of belonging. And for the newly formed Gentile church, such ideas could carry much credence. Because people were beginning to place confidence in the sign, rather than the one to whom the sign pointed. And suddenly Galatians becomes a lot more real to us, because most of us are not tempted to trust in circumcision. And that is where the argument becomes uncomfortable. Because the problem was not that these believers had rejected Christ. They had not. The problem was that Christ was no longer enough by himself. Circumcision had moved from being a covenant sign to becoming a covenant requirement. The logic sounded reasonable. Yes, Christ is Messiah. Yes, Christ saves. Yes, Christ forgives. But surely those who truly belong to God's covenant people should also be the covenant sign. Christ and circumcision. Grace and something more. Faith and something visible. That small word "and" is doing almost all the work in Galatians. A man kneels beside his bed. He believes the gospel. He knows Christ has died for his sins. Yet something inside of him remains unsettled. So he begins making promises. More discipline, more prayer, more Bible reading, more sacrifice. Not because these things are wrong, because he quietly wonders if Christ alone can really be enough. That question is much closer to Galatia than we might imagine, because Paul's concern was never merely circumcision. It was the quiet suspicion that Christ alone could not be enough. The problem with Christ Plus is that it never finishes its work, because once Christ is no longer enough, how much more is enough? How much obedience? How much sacrifice? How much discipline? How much certainty? How much evidence? The answer is always just a little more. And so Paul points somewhere completely unexpected, not to a stronger marker, not to a better badge, not to a superior achievement. He points to a cross. Because the cross does something profoundly unsettling. It removes every visible ground of confidence. Think about what Paul is actually saying. Paul doesn't offer a better religious system. he points to the crucified Messiah, and that would have sounded absurd, not only to Romans, not only to Greeks, but to many Jews as well, because crucifixion was not a symbol of honor. It represents everything that people spend their lives trying to avoid: shame, humiliation, public rejection. The very opposite of the things human beings normally use to establish identity. And yet Paul says that is where I boast. Paul isn't condemning faithfulness. He's refusing to let it occupy the place that belongs to Christ alone. But because the cross reveals something that every visible marker hides. Righteousness was never something you completed. It was something Christ accomplished. Covenant membership was never something you secured. It was something Christ secured. Acceptance before God was never something you finished. It was something Christ finished. And that changes everything. Because if Christ has already accomplished everything necessary to make us acceptable before God, then nothing remains for us to add. That is precisely what made Paul's message so offensive. It left no room for religious confidence, no room for spiritual achievement, no room for thinking we could complete what Christ had begun. The cross removes every reason to boast, not because obedience no longer matters, but because obedience can never accomplish what the cross already has. That is why Paul points to the crucified Messiah. At the cross, every attempt to establish our own righteousness comes to an end. Not because righteousness no longer matters, but because our righteousness is no longer found in ourselves. Jesus walks willingly toward the cross, stripped of honor, rejected by his own people, condemned by the religious leaders, executed by the empire. Everything that looks like success had disappeared. Yet none of these things determined his standing before the Father. They never had. And that changes the question for us. The issue is no longer, what must I add? The issue becomes, do I believe Christ has already done enough? That is why Galatians is so confronting. Because every one of us is tempted to add an "and" to the gospel. Christ and my obedience. Christ and my discipline. Christ and my spiritual consistency. Christ and the things that reassure me I already belong. Paul says the moment we begin doing that, we have quietly asked something else to share the place that belongs to Christ alone. That is the surrender Paul is inviting us into. Not the surrender of obedience, the surrender of believing obedience can accomplish what only Christ has accomplished. And perhaps that is why this passage refuses to stay in the first century, because the question never really disappeared. It simply changed clothes. And so the question remains, if Christ has already accomplished everything necessary to make you acceptable before God, what are you still trying to add? This is where Paul parts company with every religious system. Every religion eventually asks, what must I do to become acceptable? Paul points to Christ and asks a different question. If Christ has already made you acceptable, what exactly are you trying to add? Paul had once been the very man he is warning the Galatians not to become. If anyone could have trusted in religious credentials, it was Paul. If anyone could have believed righteousness came through the covenant markers and obedience, it certainly was Paul. Yet the man who once counted these things as gain would later count them as loss because of Christ. Paul once had an answer: circumcision, heritage, zeal, righteousness, achievement, everything that seemed to prove he belonged. And then he met Christ. The man who once trusted in his credentials became the man who called himself the foremost of sinners. He no longer carried the burden of making himself acceptable before God. Christ had carried it for him. That is why Paul could finally boast in the cross alone. God knew exactly who he was. God knew exactly what he had done. God knew every sin, every act of violence, every false confidence, every attempt to establish his own righteousness. And Christ died for him anyway. Everything Paul had once regarded as gain, he now regarded as loss. Not because those things were evil, but because they could never accomplish what Christ already had. Because the cross had already said everything that needed to be said. And perhaps that is why Paul could finally say, far be it from me to boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ. Because when grace finds a man in his very worst, what else is he left to boast in?